The 1990s found many American car manufacturers backtracking on their decisions from the 80s. It turned out that the subcompact market was essentially a niche market aimed at 20-somethings, where most car buyers were actually 40-somethings. And cars once again started to get bigger, with bigger engines and more power. In spite of the cars in various segments getting bigger, the most popular segment actually dropped from the full-size segment to the mid-size segment, and it seemed that everyone was throwing around the term sports sedan. For the most part, this just meant slightly better tires and suspension tuning. GM had started offering four-door versions of their more popular touring coupes, the Regal, the Cutlass Supreme, and the Grand Prix, and although they seemed sportier than GM's more traditional midsize cars that were being phased out, they could hardly be considered sporty. There were a couple of exceptions, though, such as the Taurus SHO and Dodge Spirit RT. And although these cars tended to outperform sedans that cost more than twice as much, they really didn't sell all that particularly well. Although the Taurus started out the decade as America's best-selling sedan, and as the decade progressed, more and more people were moving to imports, such as the Toyota Camry and Honda Accord. So the American brands were trying to offer cars that were more like their imported counterparts. Restyling and new names at Chrysler in the form of the Cirrus and Stratus had a minimal impact, and Ford's attempt to bring over their European sedan, the Mondeo, as the Contour and Mercury Mystique didn't really catch on in the American market. And it seems that part of the reason that people were moving to the mid-size segment from the full-size segment is that the full-size segment really wasn't getting the attention it needed. In fact, the traditional rear-wheel drive large American cars had essentially carried on to this point with only minor changes since the late 70s. But that was about to change. GM would give its rear-wheel drive full-size cars all new styling for the first time since 1977. The Caprice Classic, the Oldsmobile Custom Cruiser, the Cadillac Fleetwood, and Buick would revive the Roadmaster name and would update the styling of its large front-wheel drive cars the same year. The LeSabre, 88, 98, Bonneville, and Ford's Crown Victoria, Mercury Grand Marquis, and Lincoln Town Car would follow suit the following year. And then in 93, Chrysler would introduce the LH cars, initially as the Chrysler New Yorker and LHS, and the Dodge Intrepid, followed soon by the Eagle Vision. And it seemed that these cars had revived the segment, so much so that Chevrolet even brought back the Impala Super Sport name as a sportier full-size sedan. But this success was short-lived, as the big rear-wheel drive cars at GM would be canceled after 1996. And like Chrysler, the focus would be moved towards smaller, more modern cars and adding new powertrains, such as the new Oldsmobile Aurora with its 4-liter V8 and Cadillac's new North Star. But as it turned out, buyers weren't moving from the full-size market to the mid-size market. They were moving from the full-size market to the truck market. Full-size pickups were quickly becoming the best-selling segment in the country, and other truck-based segments were also increasing in popularity, such as SUVs and minivans. In fact, these two segments were growing fast enough that they were no longer based on existing trucks, but were being developed independently specifically for their own markets. And in some cases, even performance options were being offered, both as pickups and SUVs. Ironically, at the same time, attempts at reviving the sports car segment had failed miserably, and cars such as the Fiero, REATTA, ALLANTE, and TC Coupe by Maserati were all disappearing. There was, however, one new contender, an all-new, low-tech, old-school sports car with what was described as retro styling, in the form of the Dodge Viper. Small car, giant powerful engine. And it turned out to be the perfect halo car for Dodge. In fact, it worked so well that a few years later, Plymouth was given its own retro roadster as a halo car, with the Plymouth Prowler, which was by far more retro, but also significantly more civilized, although not all that sporty. In that same year, Chevrolet gave us the first all-new Corvette in a dozen years, a car that was considered a huge leap forward in the sports car segment. But not only were luxury sports cars disappearing, but luxury coupes in general. The Toronado was killed off in '92, and although the Mark VII was replaced by the Mark VIII, it would still only survive until '98. Buick's newer, bigger, more stylish Riviera would be killed off after '99, and Cadillac's Eldorado would only survive a few years beyond that. And the smaller touring coupe segment was struggling similarly. Chevrolet revived the Monte Carlo name for the two-door versions of the Lumina starting in '95, which was somewhat successful. And although the Thunderbird and Cougar had gained power, they'd also gained weight and were quickly falling from popularity. The Chrysler Sebring and the Dodge Avenger were essentially coupe variants of Mitsubishi's Galant, and although the Sebring convertible was actually a different car and had remained one of the top-selling convertibles on the market, it was still canceled after '97. Even in the sportier car segments, things were not going well. Chrysler was still using Mitsubishi, with a version of the 3000 GT being sold as the Dodge Stealth, and although it didn't have its active aero, it was still available with twin-turbo, all-wheel drive, all-wheel steering, but like the car it was based on, didn't really get the attention it deserved. And the new Camaro and Firebird, although they became sleeker and were a significant performance value, they still had significant quality issues. And after 15 years, Mustang styling was finally updated, and its engine updated shortly thereafter. It was essentially left in control of this segment by default, as most of its competition simply disappeared. In fact, buyers in this segment were one of the few segments that were actually still moving towards smaller cars, mostly imports. In fact, Ford's Probe was intended to replace the Mustang, and in what seems like a wise decision, opted to sell it alongside the Mustang instead. But the cars that proved popular in this segment were, for a change, Chrysler's offerings. But not surprisingly, these were once again Mitsubishi's, variations of Mitsubishi's Eclipse being sold as the Plymouth Laser and the Eagle Talon. And when it came to plain small car segments, the American companies were essentially handing them over to the imports. GM's Geo division were just rebadged cars from various Japanese companies. The small cars being offered by Dodge and Eagle were rebadged Mitsubishis, and the Ford Escort became a Mazda 323. There were some exceptions to this, most notably Saturn. Introduced at the beginning of the decade, GM's Saturn division was developed to be completely independent of all of GM's other divisions and designed with import cars as their primary competition, and for a time earned itself an almost cult-like following. And another exception was the Dodge Neon. But unlike the Saturn, instead of trying to be like an import car, focused on what Chrysler did best, a high-value small car with reasonable performance. And it proved to be very successful. But by the end of the decade, imports had taken over several market segments in the United States. Not just small car market, but also the mid-size market and the sporty coupe segments, and were quickly expanding into other market segments that were still dominated by U.S. brands, such as pickups and luxury cars. And this trend would continue into the next millennium.